Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. This is a fully narrated video that covers the process of modeling, UV unwrapping, baking and texturing a simple fantasy flower. I model it in 3ds Max 2024, unwrap it in RizomUV and texture it in Substance Painter. The turntable you see was done in Marmoset. The video has subtitles. I've sped it up twice, and if anything happens too fast at any point, you can always slow it down in YouTube settings and use the subtitles. The chapter list is in the video description and in the pinned comment. You can always check out the model on Sketchfab too. There is a link to it in the video description. By the way, if my videos are helpful to you, please be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. The assembled version of the flower ended up with 313 polygons and 339 vertices. Overall, that's something you could easily use in indie games. Initially, I unwrapped it onto a 2K UV map with a pixel padding of 16, but during texturing I downsized the resolution to 1K with 8 pixel padding. That's fine for showing the flower as a concept, but if I were working on my own project right now, I'd try to pack a bunch of plants into a single 4K texture atlas with a padding of 32. That way we make much better use of the available space. In Max, I used the Loop Regularizer plugin. Same results can be achieved with the Rapid Tools plugin. Anyways, let's go through it step by step. I started modeling from a sphere with 16 sides. In general, the exact number of sides isn't that important, as long as it's even, because I wanted to work with symmetrical petals. I extended the sphere upward and downward, removed its poles and a couple of segments on both sides, and then manually moved its vertices around to get the curve and shape I needed. I shifted from a rounded form to an almost flat one by squishing the vertices along the corresponding axis with the scale tool. Plus I removed some supporting edge loops and replaced them with new ones using the Insert Edge Loop tool while holding Shift. At some point I realized I could replace the remaining 12 sides by deleting half the vertical edges, down to 6, which define the shape of our petals. I also played with the petal shapes using an FFD 4x4x4 modifier. Before making any destructive changes, I copied the petals and hid one of the copies. Next I cut out sections from the petals, combining the Inset and Cut tools. Then I applied Shell and TurboSmooth modifiers to the petals. Shell is needed to create an illusion of the volume, while TurboSmooth gives the petals those nice organic shapes. Overall, 2 iterations of TurboSmooth are plenty. There's no point in adding more, because some detail will get lost during baking, and with the small UV map anyway. Plus we won't be seeing the flower up super close. For those of you new to modeling and baking, the amount of polygons on the high poly model doesn't matter. It can have millions of trees before baking, and your poly count will still be defined by the low poly version. Now that the high poly version of the petals is ready, I unhide my low poly version and fit it by placing it in the middle of the high poly one, while also making sure it sticks out beyond the high poly edges everywhere, so we can properly bake the high poly onto the low poly. My petals together ended up with 45 polygons. Overall, I could have reduced that even further by collapsing some vertices and adding a few triangles, but I decided not to. In this video, I'm showing a simplified way of modeling petals. Overall, we could have sculpted a high poly version of the petals in ZBrush or Blender, baked it onto a plane, and then scaled and bent the plane however we wanted. This method is great for another reason too. We can add as many petals as we need, and reuse the same ones with different sizes and different bends. The next stage is modeling the roots and stem. First, I'd like to say a few words about what guided my planning process. My flower is relatively small, and its main strengths are the bud itself, not the stem or roots. I wanted to keep it pretty concise, like a mix of physalis, a lollipop, and something out of a dream. So I decided to minimize the details in the root system. I also chose to give the roots and stem no more than 5 sides. The viewer is unlikely to notice that as a flaw. I didn't want to use sculpting, so I just created a cube, converted it to an editable poly, and turned on NURBS. I could have simply applied one iteration of OpenSubdiv to it instead. That turns the cube into a sort of a sphere, and lets us work with octagonal branches that we extrude from the faces. I created transitions using Inset, and then just pulled the faces wherever I wanted. Sometimes I added new edges with the Insert Edge Loop tool, and sometimes I rotated vertices with the Rotate tool. I often switched between local and world coordinates and extruded some polygons while holding the Shift key. Overall, I tried to avoid making the roots symmetrical, and I also tapered their ends as they got farther from the stem. The general rule is, the more cylinder bends, the more supporting edge loops it needs to look smooth, so we don't want overly curved elements. On the contrary, straight sharp transitions and tapers give us the result we're after. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have branched into 4 roots, and should have stuck to 3. It would have lowered the poly count, but more importantly, it would have broken the symmetry that we almost never see in nature. It's important to give all the roots roughly the same height from the ground plane, so nothing floats in the air. A good idea is to constantly check your model from 4 to 6 different angles and aim for each view to look as aesthetically pleasing as possible, and ideally different from the others. Of course, this doesn't apply to models that will only be seen from one angle, like if they are placed next to a wall or a tree that prevents the player from walking around them. I shaped the stem and converted the object to an editable poly. The first thing I did was thin out the excessive supporting edge loops. Some I just deleted, others I replaced. A method that often works is to insert a supporting edge loop between 2 existing ones while holding Shift, so Max respects the polygon flow, and then delete the neighboring edge loops. Once I had reduced everything I could, I realized it still wasn't done. Most roots still had 8 sides, while I had decided on 5. That's where the combo of Select Edge Ring and Collapse came in handy. I tried to collapse the edges that were least noticeable, especially the ones on the underside of the model. In some spots, triangles appeared. No big deal, we'll hardly notice any shading deformations from them. I spent quite a while thinning the topology, so I decided to speed up the video a bit there. Also, I wasn't using any reference images, and was modeling straight from my head, so I created a bunch of unnecessary objects. For example, initially the flower sphere was attached to the stem. Just ignore that. I ended up using a completely different sphere when I reworked the results of this stage. While reducing the polygon count on the roots and stem, I used Ring Select and Collapse along with the regular target weld. As I mentioned earlier, this resulted in a few triangles forming. No big deal for the ones on the underside of the roots, they don't bother us at all. Plus, most root tips had supporting edge loops that I gradually removed. It's worth noting that Collapse and target weld make our roots less perfectly round, and that's actually a good thing. We don't need them to be perfectly circular, although we could achieve that by selectively applying the loop regularizer or equivalent tool from Rapid Tools to their edge loops one by one. Overall, we could have deleted the root ends and played around with automatic retopology, gradually lowering the polygon count and picking the account that suits our needs, but I decided to do everything manually. Also, we could have erased the lower part of the root system completely, leaving some open edges there. If we wanted to optimize the flower even further, we could bake the roots onto a low-poly 4-sided stem that would spread into 4-plane rays, following our 3D roots. The main goal is to remove unnecessary edges from the bottom parts of the roots. That's where we won't notice any issues, even if the shading gets a bit messed up. If our plant ends up looking a little angular in places, that's totally fine. First, nobody's going to scrutinize the roots that closely, and second, it would actually look weird if every root and the stem were perfectly round. As I mentioned earlier, trees are fine if they are positioned in the bottom part of the root system or on the stem itself, where they don't hurt our shading. Since there aren't many edges remaining, I literally check every edge and ask myself if it's really needed there. If it doesn't serve any purpose, erase it. If you want the flower to look even better, you can activate edge constraints and move some vertices a little bit, breaking symmetry and giving your roots some character. One final piece of advice here. Even if you see an edge ring that gives a root a somewhat decent curve, ask yourself, will it be visible from your game character's height? If not, the economy is preferred. The stem has 5 sides, while the sphere I want to use has 12. I don't think introducing triangles to create a smooth transition is a good idea, so I just placed the sphere as a separate object right on top of the flower stem. Theoretically, I could have used a sphere with 10 sides. That said, I figured the lollipop-like flower is the most visually prominent part of our model, so it makes sense not to skimp too much on it. I created a temporary cap and gave it a proper center point at the upper part of the stem, then placed the sphere there using the Select and Place tool with vertex snapping turned on. After that, I positioned the petals so their most stretched part wrapped around the sphere, and then adjusted their lower section so the low-poly version touched the stem or even intersected it slightly. The next step was to make sure the low-poly part of the petals still matched the high-poly one. I aligned everything I needed using an FFD 4x4x4 modifier. The next step was creating the side stem. For that, I drew a spline, set its vertices to smooth mode, thinned out the vertices, and shaped the curve I wanted for the side stem. Then I created a pentagonal cylinder and used its lower edge ring to generate a loft object. Finally, I applied the loft to my spline and gave the side stem 5 sides. Lastly, I converted the resulting object to an editable poly and removed the unnecessary supporting edge loops. In moments like this, there is always the temptation to add a bunch of bends to the stem. Overall, it's best to avoid that, or use flat objects instead, because supporting edge loops combined with cylinders send your polygon count through the roof really fast. The stem's bend is controlled by the curve settings in the loft parameters. It's important to think about the purpose of this flower. For example, if we'll see it in a pot or standing alone in a meadow, it deserves as many details as possible. But if it's going to get lost in the grass, maybe it doesn't need the lower part or the side stem at all. Overall, you could make several variations of side stems so that from one single set you can assemble a bunch of different flower versions. One more thing, if we want to cut the polygon count even further, we'd probably be better off baking the side stem onto a curved plane. Plus, we can split the plane with a vertical edge, so it creates the illusion of the stem bending. I collapsed the top part of the side stem and simply deleted the bottom one. We won't see any open faces there, since this part intersects the main root. Then I double-checked that every object had its own low-poly and high-poly versions. I named them starting with the word flower, so I can easily group them later, and ended each name with the suffix LP or HP to mark the low-poly and high-poly elements respectively. It's important to stick to a consistent naming convention, so Substance Painter knows exactly what to bake onto what. Next I checked that none of my low-poly models had any angons or isolated or overlapping vertices. I gave the low-poly a single smoothing group and did the same for the high-poly version. We really don't have any noticeable hard edges. Plus, I positioned the group so the center of the flower's lower part sat right at the 000 world coordinates. Then I placed the pivot point of each object at its center and made sure the centers of the low-poly and high-poly objects matched perfectly. I didn't show this part in the video, but I split my model into separate FBX files, one containing the high-poly versions and the other the low-poly versions. Of course, we only unwrapped the low-poly one. I did unwrapping in RizomUV. You can use any software for that, but I wouldn't recommend Max itself, especially not without certain paid plugins. The hotkeys that helped me a lot were W to weld, C to cut, Ctrl plus page down to rotate by 90 degrees, U to unwrap, and O to optimize. I split the sphere into 2 halves. This can cause issues down the line, but I'll show you how easy they are to fix. I tried to align all the elements vertically. In general, we can make the main sphere larger, since it needs the most detail, and the petals too, of course. The bigger the corresponding UV chunks, the better the texture quality and bake results on those parts. I used the 2K resolution UV map with a pixel padding of 16, later it got scaled down to 1K with a padding of 8. Toward the end, I did my best to pack as much as possible into the available UV space. Overall, if you are approaching this seriously, it's always a good idea to unify a bunch of plants together and unwrap them onto a single 4K texture atlas to optimize the space better. The best approach is to create a kind of a kit, from which you can assemble many different variations of the same plants. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of rays on all tabs, make sure that I only have red elements inside my projection, but not outside of it, enable the transparency tab, and set my subsampling to 16. I name my suffixes the way they are named in Max, and set my ambient occlusion baking options to same named meshes only. Please ignore my weird sphere here, eventually it got replaced. As you can see, almost everything is baked properly, but the opacity doesn't work yet. In order to activate it, I go to the Shader Set Settings menu and switch my shader to PBR Metal Rough with Alpha Blending. Next I go to the Texture Set Settings menu and enable the Opacity channel. Now we have to fill our model with the opacity fill layer generated when baking. I create a fill layer, only enable the opacity channel for it, add a black mask to it, and then fill it with the opacity map generated by the baking procedure. I see some weird transparent spots that shall not be there. We can avoid them in the baking phase, but since they are already there, I simply create another 100% opacity fill layer, mask it, apply a paint layer to it, and use it to paint the opacity on those elements that shall not be transparent. The next layer contains some color, roughness and height data. It receives a black mask and a grunge map 005 fill layer that later gets covered by a blur slope filter. At this point we can play with its color, height, roughness and tiling. Remember to switch your lighting and environment settings now and then to see how your model performs under different conditions. Next I apply the Stylization tool and play around with its settings. I chose the hand-painted preset and played around with baked light, the type and amount of brush strokes. I've cut out some parts of this video where I was picking colors and bringing them all together. I didn't have a decent palette, and the process took a lot of time. Basically, I used various fill layers with different grunges and played a bit with their blending options and their base color opacity. Most changes were done to objects before applying stylization. The most important thing to consider here is the fact we need to switch the projection method of most grunges to triplanar. This way we won't have to cover our UV seams. Obviously, it can't be done to stylization, so we can't use stylization with some objects where it will mess with our seams. The workaround for it is to create a fixed paint layer, set all of its blending options to pass through, and use the Clone Stamp tool to mask all visible UV seams. To make your flower even better, it might be a good idea to know the color of the surface it will stand on. Then we would be able to apply a gradient to it, or maybe add some dirt to its roots to make it blend perfectly with its landscape. The grunges you apply to the central sphere may vary greatly depending on the way you want it to look. I used grunge maps 10, clouds 1 and leaks small. I've also played a bit with their settings, reducing the height of some layers and giving a blur slope filter to others. I liked the roughness contrast between the popsicle sphere and the surrounding petals. Next I went to the Texture Set Settings menu again and enabled the emission channel. I added another fill layer, reduced its height, activated its emission channel, chose its emission color, masked it and applied a paint layer to it, which was used to paint some glowing dots. Finally, I applied the ground dirt gradient to my model by using the preset Smart Mask. Remember to always switch your grunge projection methods to triplanar. To give the stem some details, I've added a height data fill layer to it and used the grunge map 005 again. I didn't like its uniform direction in the bottom part of the model, so I've copied this layer and changed its projection method to spherical. Then I only applied this layer to the root system and painted the transition between two grunges manually. To do this, I masked the corresponding folder, applied it to the roots and used the eraser tool on my mask while altering its brush hardness and flow every now and then. You can also play around with its blending options at any time. Anyways, I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, please be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.